On a warm Colorado morning in mid-August, Elliot Granger's old drill whirred to life just as a crisp envelope from the HOA slid beneath his garage door. He didn't hear the envelope arrive at first. The steady hum of the motor, the smell of solder and sawdust, and the grin on Jasper's face filled the garage with a sense of satisfaction too rare these days. Elliot leaned in, guiding the boys' small hands as they steadied the makeshift rover's wobbly wheel. The cardboard chassis trembled under the tension of its first power test. "That's it," Elliot said, his voice gentle but firm. "Now give it juice." Jasper flipped the switch, and the tiny contraption jolted forward, skidding a few inches across the table. It veered left and bumped into a pair of pliers, knocking them aside with a satisfying thud. The boy let out a triumphant laugh, his eyes wide. "I told you it would work," he cried. "I had my doubts," Elliot teased, ruffling the boy's hair, "but you proved me wrong." Outside, a breeze stirred the early fall flowers still blooming along the edge of the driveway. A cluster of purple asters bent beneath it, nodding toward the sidewalk like they were eavesdropping. Then came the shadow. Dolores Kinsey, HOA president and unchallenged queen of Briar Hill's rose hedges, paused near the open garage. Her gaze swept over the buzzing motor, the scattered tools, the boy's joyful expression. Her lips tightened. Without a word, she raised her phone, snapped a picture, and moved on down the sidewalk, like she'd just spotted graffiti on a church wall. Jasper noticed. "The HOA lady?" Elliot offered a soft sigh. "That's her." By the time Jasper's mom called him home for lunch, the boy had proudly tucked the rover under his arm. Elliot watched him run across the lawn, the cardboard wheels bouncing with each step before returning to the garage. His space, his rhythm, his peace. That's when he saw it. A stark white envelope, half slid under the garage door, clean edges crisp against the concrete. His name was printed in block letters on the front. He picked it up and opened it slowly, already bracing himself. Notice of violation. Briar Hills, Hull. Subject: unapproved noise-emitting activity from private garage, including mechanical sounds audible from public right-of-way. The notice warned of non-compliance. A citation. Future fines. He let out a dry laugh that didn't quite sound like one. That evening at the Rusty Bean Cafe, a narrow little diner tucked between a quilt shop and a dry cleaner, Elliot sat across from Mr. Morgan, a man with a cane, a deep love for apple pie, and an even deeper hatred for bureaucracy. "She got you, huh?" Morgan asked between sips of black coffee. Elliot nodded. Apparently drills and laughter fall under noise pollution. Morgan snorted. That woman once cited a kid's lemonade stand for violating vendor code. The waitress brought their usual 2 eggs for Morgan, toast and jelly for Elliot, plus a refill without asking. "She ever smile?" Elliot asked. "Once," Morgan said, "when the new neighbors planted petunias 2 inches outside the approved color palette. Back home, the garage was still warm from the sun." He turned on the overhead lamp and stared at the bench, half-wired projects, rolls of copper tape, a poster of the Apollo 11 command module yellowing at the corners. He hadn't changed much since Ruth passed. Her handwriting still graced a sticky note above the workbench, "Mind the voltage, dear." His hands hovered over the tools. Then he reached for the broom instead. He swept slowly, methodically. The mechanical clock above the door ticked out its steady rhythm, as if counting time down toward something inevitable. 2 days later, another envelope came. Same font, same seal, only this one was thicker. Inside was a fine schedule, $50, 0 cents per day for every non-compliant audible event. A printed warning advised that failure to comply might lead to additional sanctions, including legal escalation. Elliot folded the letter with precision, placed it in the drawer beside the pegboard, and closed it without a sound. When Jasper returned that afternoon, he held the rover like it was a fragile treasure, but his smile wavered when he saw Elliot's face. "Did I do something wrong?" "Not you," Elliot said gently, "just the world trying to stay boring." They worked quietly for a while. Jasper adjusted the wheels. Elliot replaced a broken switch. But the air had shifted. Jasper finally looked up, hesitating. "Does this mean I can't come back anymore?" Elliot hadn't read the HOA bylaws in 20 years. Now he was learning them better than the HOA president herself. His kitchen table had vanished beneath a sea of paper. Some pages were original, yellowed and curled at the corners. Others were freshly printed, speckled with smudges from highlighters in 3 different colors. Elliot's coffee had gone cold twice already, and the 3rd mug now sat forgotten at the edge of the table, a faint coffee ring spreading underneath. Outside, the early September sun glinted off the lawn where a squirrel scolded no one in particular. Inside, the only sounds were the steady ticking of the clock and the rasp of Elliot's rotary pencil sharpener. He paused, squinting at a paragraph on page 17, temporary educational activity, with prior notification to the board. He read it again, then a third time. A slow grin tugged at the edge of his mouth. The HOA had rules, yes, but buried in the text, likely overlooked by Dolores Kinsey's iron glare, was permission. Not freedom, perhaps, but space. A clause allowing for short-term educational use of garages if pre-approved, the type of clause that didn't draw attention, the type that Dolores herself had used. He glanced toward the corner of the table where a dog-eared HOA newsletter sat folded open. On the front page, a photo of Dolores in a wide-brimmed hat standing beside rows of tomato seedlings. President Kinsey's Garden Literacy Hour, a blooming success, dated summer 2020. The caption was signed with approval by the HOA board and countersigned by Dolores. Elliot chuckled softly. "Nothing happens here without her signature," she had once said to poor Ron Walters, who had tried to hang a wind spinner shaped like a hummingbird. She wasn't wrong. But maybe, just maybe, he could make her signature work against her. He stuffed the newsletter into a folder and left the house, stopping only to grab his wool cardigan and tuck a pencil behind his ear. At the Rusty Bean Cafe, Mr. Morgan sat at their usual booth, his cane resting against the wall, a plate of eggs already cooling in front of him. A small group of older men at the counter debated whether the coming winter would be wet or merely miserable. "You look like a man on a mission," Morgan said, watching Elliot ease into the booth. "I've got a hunch," Elliot replied, waving for coffee. The waitress poured without asking. "I went digging," Elliot continued, lowering his voice slightly. "The bylaws aren't as airtight as she thinks. There's an exemption for temporary education. Dolores herself used it 3 years ago." Morgan raised his eyebrows. "So what's the plan?" "Compliance, down to the letter. No violations, no noise beyond 6 p.m., every notice hand-delivered." Morgan grinned. "Every rule has a counter-rule." Later that afternoon, Elliot stood in the small foyer of the Briar Hills HOA office. It smelled faintly of carpet glue and lemon disinfectant. A framed print of a sailing ship hung crookedly behind the front desk. Dolores sat alone, tapping something into her phone with 2 fingers. When she looked up, her expression didn't bother to hide annoyance. "Mr. Granger, I've come to notify the board of an upcoming educational workshop," he said, pulling a printed form from his folder. Her eyes narrowed. "On what grounds?" "Section 4, Sublaws C," Elliot said calmly. "Temporary educational use of garage property with board notification." "That's obscure." "Still binding." She took the paper, glanced at it, then folded it deliberately and set it aside without comment. "The board will review." "That's all I need," Elliot replied, already turning to leave. As he stepped outside, he let the door click softly behind him. The air felt just a little cooler. His next stop was the Littleton Public Library, where he made his way past tall shelves and displays of autumn-themed book picks to the reference desk. Nora, the town's senior librarian for 3 decades, wore a blue cardigan with acorns embroidered on the sleeves. "Elliot Granger," she said, peering over her glasses, "haven't seen you since the great almanac argument of '09. "I'm still right about that frost date," he replied with a grin. He explained his goal, a legal learning space, nonprofit, no sales, all volunteer. Nora didn't hesitate. She pulled a thick binder from beneath the desk and opened it to a tab labeled Community Use Educational. "You'll need a basic nonprofit declaration and then apply for limited use zoning. If you meet both, they can't block you. It's in the city code." "You sure?" Nora smiled. "Honey, we helped a retired dentist teach bridge out of his basement. You'll be fine." She handed him a stapled packet and a peppermint candy. "Start here." At home that night, Elliot opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a roll of dusty blueprint paper, stiff from time. He laid it across the kitchen table, smoothing it gently. Then, using a freshly sharpened pencil, he bent over the paper and began to write in neat, blocky letters. He unrolls his father's old blueprint paper and draws the words, "STEM Garage, Community Application." The garage smelled of motor oil and lemon cleaner. Elliot had never cleaned it so thoroughly because this time the city inspector was coming. He'd been up since 6, polishing tool handles, rewinding extension cords and scrubbing the old pegboard until it looked almost new. Even the clock had been dusted, its copper frame glinting faintly beneath the overhead lights. The floor, once scuffed from decades of tinkering, now reflected the room like a dim mirror. He had even ironed his shirt, a pale blue button-down Ruth had once called his diplomatic shirt. Mr. Morgan showed up just after 8, carrying a thermos and a lopsided grin. "Figured you'd be wound tight as a banjo string." "I'm fine," Elliot lied, accepting the coffee. "Mostly." "You're shaken." "Just a little." "Good. Means you care." They shared a few sips in the driveway while the breeze whispered through the turning leaves. Across the street, a yellow school bus pulled away from the curb. Jasper had waved from the back window, grinning through fogged glass. "Kids will be disappointed if this doesn't go through," Morgan said softly. "I will too," Elliot murmured. At City Hall, the permit office sat tucked between the treasurer's desk and a vending machine that only dispensed Diet Coke. The woman behind the counter wore red glasses and a sunflower pin on her cardigan. "Community Learning Initiative?" she asked, flipping through the stack of papers Elliot handed over. "Yes, ma'am. Nonprofit, single site, use no money exchanged, garage-based, STEM education." She read for a moment, then looked up. "STEM garage. Sounds like something my grandson would love." She stamped the first page. "We'll get the zoning variance review started. Should hear something soon." As they stepped back into the hallway, a familiar voice called out behind them. "Mr. Granger." They turned as Shelley Kinsey stood near the building directory, a reusable coffee cup in one hand and a stack of science supply catalogs in the other. Elliot blinked. "Shelley, didn't expect to see you here." "I teach across the street," she explained. "I heard something about a garage science lab." He hesitated. "Just trying to build something for the neighborhood." "Quiet." She smiled. "Good luck being quiet with 10-year-olds and baking soda rockets." Morgan chuckled behind him. "She's not wrong." Shelley's expression softened. "You'll be great. If you need help, I'm around." Back home, Elliot paced the driveway until he saw the city inspector's white sedan turn the corner. The man stepped out, clipboard in hand, and surveyed the garage with a practiced eye. "Emergency exits?" he asked. "2," Elliot replied. "Here and through the side door." "Fire extinguisher?" "Mounted near the pegboard." The inspector walked slowly through the space, nodding at the labeled bins, the laminated safety signs, and the chairs set neatly in a semicircle. He lingered for a moment at the wall clock, then turned back with a small smile. "Looks like a good place to learn." After he left, Elliot sat on the back steps and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That evening, Jasper stopped by with a pair of sidewalk chalk sticks and an idea for a sign. "Can we call it the STEM Cave?" he asked. Elliot laughed. "Let's go with garage more like." Together they drew a few rough letters on a scrap of wood, then painted over them in navy blue. Elliot drilled small holes into the top and hung it beside the garage door. "Dem garage curiosity welcome." Charlie stood across the street, arms folded, watching quietly as the sign went up. A few neighborhood kids lingered nearby, peeking inside at the neatly organized shelves and boxes marked resistors, wheels, tinker tools. Later that night, Elliot opened his email and stared at the subject line for several long seconds. "Permit pending approval, Community STEM Initiative." The message was brief but official. They were one step closer. Across the street, Dolores Kinsey returned from her walk. She noticed something sticking out of her mailbox and pulled it free. It was a heavy cardstock flyer printed in bright ink. "For STEM Workshop, sponsored by Briar Hills residents." Her roses tremble as she grips the paper. The approval came on a Thursday morning, tucked between junk mail and a seed catalog, but to Elliot, it felt like a victory medal. He opened the envelope slowly, not out of doubt but reverence. The letterhead from the city of Littleton gleamed slightly in the morning sun. His hands, still smelling faintly of wood polish and lemon cleaner, trembled as he read the first line. "Permit approved for temporary educational use under Municipal Exemption Code 3.14b. She didn't smile right away. He just stood still for a moment in the doorway of the garage, letting the quiet victory settle into the bones. Then, with deliberate care, he reached for a small frame he'd bought at the thrift shop the week before. The paper fit just inside. He hung it next to the pegboard, above the sign that read, "STEM Garage, Curiosity Welcome." Mr. Morgan arrived shortly after, a paper bag in one hand, a traffic cone in the other. "Figured you'd need these more than I do," he said, setting the cone near the driveway. "And this," he added, handing over the bag, "is a laminated first aid checklist. I used it during the Great Chili Cook-Off incident of '98. By mid-afternoon, the garage had transformed into something between a school lab and a Boy Scout hall. Folding chairs lined one wall, bins labeled screws, all sizes, and solar kit, 4th grade, sat neatly stacked, and 2 orange safety cones marked off the no running zone. A small cooler filled with juice boxes hummed in the corner. Kids walked home from school in small clusters, craning their necks toward Elliot's open garage windows. One girl whispered something to her friend and pointed at the wires and blinking LEDs. Another boy on a bike slowed down just to stare. "Word's getting out," Mr. Morgan said, watching from the porch, "and not just among the under-12 crowd." At the corner of Maple and Cherry Lane, Mrs. Dorsey, who usually only waved through blinds, walked over carrying a loaf of something wrapped in foil. "It's zucchini bread," she explained, "and I don't care what the board says. I think it's wonderful what you're doing." Elliot thanked her with a quiet nod. The loaf was warm. But not all visitors were welcome. That evening, an email landed in inboxes across Briar Hills. "Emergency HOA meeting, Friday at 7 p.m. Agenda, use of personal property for unauthorized activity." The community clubhouse felt colder than usual the next night. Chairs were arranged in sharp rows. Dolores stood at the front, flanked by the board, Mr. Langley, who mostly nodded along, and Mrs. Patel, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Dolores opened with no preamble. "We are here tonight to address a disruption to the peace and predictability of our neighborhood." Elliot sat 2 rows back, arms crossed. Mr. Morgan sat beside him, whispering a steady stream of sarcastic commentary that Elliot mostly tuned out. "Mr. Granger," Dolores continued, "has initiated an ongoing operation in his garage without proper review by this board. The activity invites minors not under his guardianship and introduces noise, foot traffic, and potential liability." Elliot stood. "With respect, I followed all required procedures. I notified the board under Sublaw C and I received city approval under education exemption zoning. We are not bound by city paperwork," Dolores snapped. "Actually, you are," said a voice from the back. Everyone turned. Shelley Kinsey stepped forward. She held a slim folder but didn't open it. Her presence was enough. The city's legal advisor was clear. In cases of educational use backed by municipal approval, HOA zoning is superseded, she said simply. Lawrence's face tightened. "You don't speak for the board." "No," Shelley replied, "but I do understand the law." The room was silent. Even Mr. Langley looked down at his notepad. Dolores abruptly gathered her papers. "This isn't over." She stormed out without another word, her footsteps sharp against the tile. Outside, neighbors lingered in small clusters. A few offered Elliot quiet smiles. One even patted him on the shoulder as she passed. Another man simply said, "Keep going." The next morning, Elliot stepped onto his porch with a fresh cup of coffee. The air was cooler now. Early autumn had begun to slip into the bones of the day. Yellow leaves collected against the curb. When he opened his mailbox, he found a single sheet of white paper. No stamp, no signature, just 10 words typed neatly in bold. "Noise is a virus, and you're infecting the neighborhood." The folding chairs were borrowed, the extension cords tangled, and Elliot's hands trembled as he chalked "welcome" on the driveway. He crouched low, trying to keep the lines even, despite the jitter in his fingers. The sun was still low, casting golden lines across the street, and the sidewalk bore faint chalk remnants from the kids' after-school doodles earlier that week. His block letters, wobbly but legible, spelled "hope" in yellow and blue. Behind him, the garage was transformed. Light streamed through the open door, bouncing off shelves stacked with labeled bins. A plastic folding table served as the day's lab station, topped with lemon halves, copper wire, zinc nails, and a box of tiny LED bulbs. A stool held a clipboard like a makeshift lectern, and Elliot's workshop apron bore a fresh smudge of chalk. Jasper was first to arrive, buzzing with excitement, his arms full of cardboard and wires. "Can I be the helper today?" he asked. "You're the assistant instructor," Elliot said, handing him a laminated badge. "Promoted on merit." By 10 o'clock, the driveway had come alive. Folding chairs spilled onto the lawn, where parents sipped from thermoses of cocoa and cider. A plate of pumpkin muffins, courtesy of Mrs. Dorsey, disappeared almost instantly. One man passed out copies of his grandmother's molasses cookie recipe. Someone else brought a quilt to sit on. Shelley arrived with a crate of circuit diagrams and a box of extra batteries. She wore a loose flannel and jeans, her hair tied back. She gave Elliot a nod across the lawn and moved to the side to help a pair of girls wire their first lemon lights. Elliot tapped the clipboard to call attention. All right, scientists, today we're going to light up a circuit using lemons. Jasper raised his hand. Don't eat the parts. Laughter bubbled through the group. Each team gets 2 lemons, a copper nail, a zinc strip, and a bulb, Elliot continued. The goal? Make it glow. The kids dove in. There were giggles, frowns, fingers smudged with juice and pencil marks. One group accidentally shorted their circuit and squealed when it sparked faintly. Another group got theirs to light, and Jasper clapped like they'd invented electricity. Positive to the zinc, he told a curious kindergartner. The electrons like it better that way. The camera crew pulled up just as things were humming. Rebecca Hart, a Channel 7 reporter with a bright scarf and calm voice, approached Shelley first. We're doing a segment on community innovation. Heard there was something electric happening in a garage. Shelley gave a brief smile. Kids are learning. Less newsworthy to me. The camera swept across the scene. Kids focused, parents smiling, wires glowing faintly in glass jars. Then a car door slammed. Dolores Kinsey marched down the sidewalk in sensible heels, a manila folder clutched in one hand like a sword. Her cardigan was buttoned to the top. Her eyes swept the gathering, resting briefly on the camera before locking on Elliot. This is an unsanctioned public gathering, she said loudly. There was no HOA review. You are in direct violation of community ordinance. Rebecca tilted the camera slightly, zooming in. Elliot didn't move. He reached calmly under the table and pulled out a small folder of his own. These are laminated copies of my permit, he said, handing one to her. Zoning approval, educational exemption, municipal compliance. Dolores fumbled a page, her mouth opening and closing. This doesn't account for volume, for safety, for foot traffic. A few parents shifted in their seats. Someone offered her a pumpkin muffin. She declined. The city of Littleton approved this event, Elliot said quietly, and everyone here came by choice. For a moment it looked like she might explode. Instead she turned to Rebecca and muttered, You'll be hearing from state officials. Then she retreated across the street, folder clenched, heels clicking harder than necessary. Back at the garage, the kids never stopped. One boy cheered as his lemon light blinked on. Another girl showed her mom how to trace current with her finger. By noon, the garage was buzzing like a honeycomb. Mr. Morgan handed out juice boxes. Shelley helped a girl build a paper circuit flower. Jasper proudly displayed a working 2-lemon chain to a cluster of awestruck kindergartners. As the last family packed up their folding chairs, Elliot stood at the garage door, hands in his pockets, watching the street slowly return to its quiet rhythm. Across the way, Dolores's blinds twitched. That evening, inboxes across Briar Hills pinged with a new HOA message. Subject: Unauthorized activity threatens neighborhood values. For the first time in years, the Briar Hills clubhouse parking lot was full, and no one was here to talk about landscaping. Cars lined the curb like bookends, headlights flicking off as neighbors stepped out, many still clutching casserole dishes or lemon bars on waxed paper. The cool October air swept through the hedges and across the flagstone walk as a fall wind teased loose a scattering of leaves. Inside the folding chairs had been arranged in clean, even rows. A table in the back held a tray of decaf, a pitcher of water, and a pile of napkins someone had thoughtfully folded into triangles. Elliot sat 3 rows from the front, Mr. Morgan beside him in a flannel jacket, cane resting against the leg of his chair. The room hummed with the low murmur of residents talking in pairs, the occasional sniffle, and the click of a thermos lid unscrewing. Dolores Kinsey stood at the front, flanked by the familiar board, silent, slightly anxious. She cleared her throat and began. Good evening. We're here tonight to propose a clarification of our community standards, specifically to limit private property from being used for recurring, structured, non-residential activities that may disrupt neighborhood harmony. She paused, letting the language settle. This is not about any one resident, she continued, though everyone knew it was. It's about preserving the character and peace of Briar Hills. There were nods from 2 or 3 familiar loyalists, but most faces remained still. Elliot said nothing. Not yet. Shelley stood. I'm not a board member, she said, voice steady, but I am a resident, and a teacher, and a daughter. All eyes turned. When I was 10, I built a vinegar volcano in our kitchen. Mom, Dolores, wasn't thrilled, but she let me finish it. That mattered. She stepped forward, folder in hand, but didn't open it. Now I teach middle school science. I see kids who can memorize formulas, but freeze when asked to build or wonder or try. Elliot gave them space, gave them tools, gave them pride, and now we're debating whether that's too noisy. Her voice shook just a little. We should be cheering. Someone in the back clapped, then 2 more. A woman stood up. My son Caleb. He doesn't talk in class, but last week he showed me a flashlight he made with Mr. Granger. He slept with it on. The father near the wall nodded. My daughter came home covered in copper tape, said she'd never had so much fun with fruit. The room rippled with laughter. Mr. Morgan rose slowly. He carried the small clubhouse flag folded neatly in his arms. He placed it on the front table before speaking. I fought in a place where kids weren't allowed to learn. This garage? He looked around, voice firm. It's the most American thing I've seen in this place in 20 years. Silence. And then the vote began, not called by the board, but by the people. Hands rose, not just politely but proudly. Some old, some young, some shy, but most were steady. When the count was read, 82 opposed, 14 in favor. Dolores' shoulders dropped slightly. She gathered her papers, lips pressed tight. No one cheered, no one gloated, but there was a warmth in the room that hadn't been there before, a quiet reclaiming of place. Elliot stepped outside into the crisp air, watching as people filed past, offering quiet words and firm handshakes. Jasper's parents smiled. Mrs. Dorsey handed him a folded note with a pie recipe on it. Across the street the garage glowed, light pouring from the windows like a beacon. Inside shelves waited, circuits gleamed, and the chalkboard still bore the words, "Build something bright." Dolores lingered in her seat, watching through the clubhouse window as Elliot locks up his glowing garage across the street. The garage lights glowed across the street. Dolores closed her blinds, but the whole town could still see. Even with the curtains drawn, the soft buzz of children's laughter slipped through the cracks like wind through a loose shutter. The voices weren't loud, just steady, joyful, layered with quiet discovery. It was the sound of a place alive. On Channel 7, the segment aired just after the evening weather report, The Garage That Changed a Neighborhood. Rebecca Hart narrated over footage of Elliot showing Jasper how to trace current across a lemon-pounded circuit. Parents offered short, sincere testimonials. One neighbor gestured at a schematic drawing and simply said, "My kid hasn't looked at a screen in 3 hours." The report ended with a slow pan across the chalkboard inside the garage, "Build something bright." Dolores sat in her armchair, arms folded, mouth tight. The next morning she sent an email titled "Unauthorized Press Use in Residential Zone." She cited outdated HOA bylaws and demanded a board meeting. No one responded. She printed the letter, hand-delivered it to the city office, and waited at the counter. The clerk behind the desk blinked. "Ma'am, you signed the exemption paperwork last year. Page 3, right here." She took the document without a word and left. That weekend, Elliot added new shelving to the west wall. The labels were carefully printed. Capacitors, switches, wires, long. A small sunflower in a mason jar sat beside the soldering station. Mr. Morgan contributed a metal stool from his garage, which he polished for the first time in 2 decades. Kids came in waves. Some came early, some stayed late. Shelley spent Saturday morning helping a third-grader build a light-up bookmark. She moved easily through the room, patient and precise. That evening, Rebecca Hart returned for follow-up interviews. This time, she spoke with Shelley. "My mother and I disagree," Shelley said gently, "but disagreement isn't a threat. It's a chance to learn. I believe in what we're building here, not just circuits, but confidence." By Monday, yard signs dotted Briar Hills. "STEM is welcome here." Some were hand-painted, others were printed with little rockets and glowing light bulbs. One simply read, "Let kids build." Dolores walked past them every morning. Her route didn't change, but her posture did. She walked slower, straighter. She didn't wave anymore. Not many waved back. She called the HOA board to schedule another meeting. They told her there were no items to review. That Thursday she crossed the street. Elliot's garage door was open as usual. Inside, a dozen children leaned over projects. The scent of solder and orange peels filled the air. A parent poured cocoa into paper cups near the side table. Below stepped 1 foot over the threshold. 2 parents looked up. One smiled, not unkindly. "Sorry," the woman said, gently blocking the way. "This time's for learners. Guests need to register in advance." Dolores opened her mouth, but no words came. She nodded once, turned, and stepped back into the sunlight. Leaves crunched beneath her shoes as she crossed the quiet street. Chevy waited at the sidewalk. Without speaking, the two began to walk, mother and daughter side by side. Behind them, the garage lights flickered, warm and steady. Kids laughed inside, and the faint hum of soldering irons floated into the October air. Shelley walks to Lois' home. No word, just the hum of kids laughing and the faint glow of soldering irons in the background. By Halloween, the garage no longer felt like a protest, it felt like part of the town. The morning sun lit up the hay bales stacked at the edge of the green, their golden edges glowing like they'd been painted in honey. Cider simmered in giant pots beside the library's porch. Children darted between booths in flannel shirts and fairy wings, faces painted with stars and spiders, voices rising in shrieks of delighted chaos. At the far end of the fall festival, under a canopy trimmed with orange ribbon, the STEM booth bustled. The table was covered in pumpkin-shaped magnets, paper circuits, and tubes of glitter glue. A cardboard maze, mounted on a baking sheet, challenged kids to steer a tiny pumpkin magnet from start to finish using only invisible force and patience. Magnetism, Jasper explained proudly to a third grader. It's basically magic, but real. Elliot stood nearby, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His plaid shirt was tucked in, and a sunflower pin clung awkwardly to his collar. He was surrounded by questions about lemons, about battery packs, about how to make a rocket with paper and a straw. And he answered each one like he had all the time in the world. A man with a clipboard stepped onto the small riser near the community gazebo and tapped the microphone. Today, he said, we honor someone who reminded us that you don't need a degree or a big building to teach something important. Sometimes all it takes is a garage, a little patience, and a lot of wire. He held up a wooden plaque to Elliot Granger for restoring curiosity and community. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then strong and steady. Elliot blinked hard, then gave a small wave. I didn't restore anything, he said into the mic, voice low. It was already here, just needed a light switch. Afterward, Mr. Morgan led Elliot to the garden bed near the sidewalk, now bordered by hand-painted stones. He knelt, grunting, and pressed a small sunflower seedling into the soil. Last one, he said. She'll come up bright next spring. Shelley joined them a moment later, holding a folded newsletter. They're redoing the HOA charter, she said. New elections next month. Elliot raised an eyebrow. I'm running, she added, not to control it, just help it grow. She smiled. Turns out, people like curiosity more than conformity. Across the lawn, Dolores passed behind the cider stand. She didn't stop to speak, but she paused near the sunflower bed, her hand brushing the bloom's soft edge for a moment before she turned and kept walking. Later that afternoon, a new family arrived, parents, 2 small kids, and a wagon full of snacks and folding chairs. They lingered near the edge of the garage, watching Jasper explain a rocket launcher to a group of girls in superhero capes. The little girl tugged at her dad's hand. Can we go see the garage? She asked, eyes wide. Elliot stepped forward and knelt to meet her gaze. You bet, kidda, we've got rockets today. Nearby, laughter bubbled like a slow boil. Cinnamon lingered in the air. Someone passed around cups of cocoa with whipped cream and nutmeg. The sky darkened slowly, sun dipping low, light slanting gold through the oak trees. As the sun sets, the garage door rolls up one more time, and warm light spills onto the sidewalk. By the time the last sunflower bloomed beside the garage, the neighborhood had changed, not with noise or protests, but with light, laughter, and learning. Rules once used to suppress had been rewritten by kindness, curiosity, and quiet determination. When power is claimed by the few, it takes a united voice to restore balance. And sometimes that voice begins with a child holding a soldering wand. Like a sunflower turning toward the sun, communities flourish when they are allowed to grow toward what's good. If this story stirred something in you, maybe it's time to dust off your garage and let it glow.